Hello. Zane, lay down. Hello. I'm unsure why that last video decided to just stop. I figured out where it left off and I'm gonna finish this chapter. Alright. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to his office, snapped at his secretary not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind, put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache, thinking, no, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there were lots of people called Potter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure if his nephew was called Harry. He'd never even seen the boy. It might have been Harvey, or Harold. There was no point in worrying Mr. Dursley. She always got so upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her, if he'd had a sister like that. But all the same, those people in cloaks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon, and when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried about what he had about. He was still so worried that he walked straight into someone just outside the door. Sorry, he grunted. But the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realized that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem all upset at being almost knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split in a wide smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that made passer-by stare, "Don't worry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day." And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Zane.
You got his tablet?
Yes, it's over here charging.
To me, see if this will fit.
No, where was I?
I have it too.
Zane,
I want to charge it in there, okay?
you need to lay down, buddy. You need to lay down.
Lay down.
Lay down. You ready?
Yeah.
Mr. Dursley stood rooted to the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he had been called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off for home, hoping he was imagining things. Can you please stop?
Yeah.
If yeah, then do stop, because I've told you to stop several times and you will not. You need to lay down and go to sleep. I'm trying to read you a story, and you're being bad.
I know.
Then lay down and go to sleep. Where was that? He hurried to his car and set off for home, hoping he was imagining things, which he had never hoped for, because he didn't approve of imagination. Lay down. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat he'd spotted that morning. It was sitting on his garden wall. He was sure that it was the same one. It had the same markings around its eyes. "Shoot!" said Mr. Dursley loudly. Lay down. The cat didn't move. It gave him a stern look. Zane, lay down. Put your head on the pillow. Lay down like a normal person with your legs under the blanket so that you can't easily lay up. What? Just stop being bad, okay? Was this normal cat behavior? Mr. Dursley wondered, trying to pull himself together. He let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had a nice, normal day. She told him over dinner all about Mrs. Next Door's problems and her daughter and how Dudley had learned a new word, won't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normally. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went into the living room in time to catch the last report on the evening news. And finally, bird watchers everywhere have reported that the nation's owls have been behaving very unusual today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newscaster allowed himself to grin. Most mysterious. And now, over to Jim McGuffin with the weather. Going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim? Well, Ted, said the weatherman, I don't know about that. But it's not only owls who have been acting oddly today. Viewers as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire, and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me that instead of rain I promised yesterday, they had a downpour of shooting stars. What? Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks. But I can promise a wet night tonight. Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain? Owls flying by daylight? Mysterious people in cloaks all over the place? And a whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear, you haven't heard from your sister lately, have you? As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister. No, she said sharply. Why? I'm just gonna go with these voices. Funny stuff on the news, Mr. Dursley mumbled. Owls, shooting stars. And there was a lot of funny-looking people in town today. So? Snapped Mrs. Dursley. Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, her crowd. Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared tell her he'd heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, Instead, he said, as casually as he could, "Their son. He'd be about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he?" "I suppose so," said Mrs. Dursley stiffly. "What's his name again? Howard, isn't it?" "Harry. Nasty common name, if you ask me." "Ah, yes, Mr. Dursley," said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. "Yes, I quite agree." He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. "Stop playing." While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept into the bedroom window and peered down into the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Privet Drive as though it were waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could all this have anything to do with the Potters? If it did, if it got out that they were related to a pair of, well, he didn't think he could bear it. The Dursleys got in the bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even the Potters were involved. Whatever. There was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well that he and Petunia thought about them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. How he was very wrong. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no sign of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkingly on the far corner of Privet Drive. It didn't so much as quiver when a car door slammed on the next street, nor when two owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared on the corner. The cat had been watching. Appeared so suddenly and silently, you'd have thought he'd just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched, and its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been seen on Privet Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver in his hair and beard, which were both long enough to be tucked in his belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak that swept the ground, and high-heeled, buckled boots. His blue eyes were light, bright, and sparkling behind half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked, as though it had been broken at least twice. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realize that he had just arrived in the street where everything from his name to his boots was unwelcome. He was very rummaging. He was very rummaging. He was busy rummaging in his cloak, looking for something. He did seem to realize he was being watched, because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was still staring at him from the other end of the street. For some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, "I should have known!" Yeah. Alright. He found what he was looking for inside his pocket. In his inside pocket. It seemed to be a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it open, held it up in the air, and clicked it. The nearest street lamp went out, and with a little pop. He clicked it again. The next lamp flickered into darkness. 12 times he clicked the put-outer, until the only lights left on the whole street were 2 tiny pinpricks in the distance, which were the eyes of the cat watching him. If anyone looked out their window now, even bright-eyed Mrs. Dursley, they wouldn't be able to see anything that was happening down on the pavement. I'm just skipping words. Can you stop? Lay down. And just listen. And stop being annoying.
No.
That's a weird. What am I hearing? I doubt you can hear it, but it's like an ice cream truck. And it's like 9:30 at night.
Yes.
Very strange. Dumbledore slipped the put-outer back inside his cloak and set off down the street toward number 4, where he sat down on the wall next to the cat. He didn't look at it, but after a moment he spoke to it. "Fancy seeing you here, Professor McGonagall." He turned and smiled at the tabby, but it had gone. Instead, he was smiling at a rather severe-looking woman who was wearing square glasses and exactly the shape of the markings the cat had around its eyes. She, too, was wearing a cloak, an emerald one. Her black hair was drawn into a tight bun. She looked distinctly ruffled. How did you know it was me?" she asked. My dear Professor, I've never seen a cat sit so stiffly." I think I'm forgetting the voice, but who cares? "You'd be stiff if you'd been sitting on a brick wall all day," said Professor McGonagall. "All day? When you could have been celebrating? I might have passed a dozen feasts and parties on my way here." Professor McGonagall sniffed angrily. "Oh yes, everyone's celebrating, all right," she said impatiently. "You'd think they'd be a bit more careful, but no. Even the Muggles have noticed something's going on. It's on the news." She jerked her head back at the Dursleys' dark living room window. "I heard it. Flock of owls, shooting stars. Well, They're not completely stupid. They were bound to notice something. Shooting stars down in Kent. I'll bet that was Daedalus Diggle. He never had much sense. You can't blame them, said Dumbledore gently. We've had precious little to celebrate for 11 years. I know that, said Professor McGonagall irritably. But that's no reason to lose our heads. People are being downright careless out on the streets in broad daylight.
Oh.
Not even dressed in muggle clothes, swapping rumors. She threw a sharp, sideways glance at Dumbledore here, as she went, as though hoping he was going to tell her something. But he didn't. So she went on. A fine thing it would be of it, be if, on the very day you know who seems to have disappeared at last, the muggles found out about us all. I suppose he really has gone. Dumbledore? It certainly seems so, said Dumbledore. We have much to be thankful for. Would you care for a lemon drop? A what? A lemon drop. They're a kind of muggle sweets I'm rather fond of. No, thank you, said Professor McGonagall coldly, as though she didn't think this was the moment for lemon drops. As I say, even you know who has gone. My dear Professor, surely a sensible person like yourself can call him by his name. All the you know who stuff. For 11 years I have been trying to persuade people to call him by his proper name, Voldemort. Professor McGonagall flinched, but Dumbledore, who was unsticking 2 lemon drops, seemed not to notice.
A, B, C, D.
It's rather it all gets so confusing if you know who. I have never seen any reason to be frightened of saying Voldemort's name. I know you. Hush. Okay. I know you haven't, said Professor McGonagall, sounding half exasperated, half admiring. But you're different. Everyone knows you're the only one you know. Oh, all right. Voldemort was frightened of. You flatter me, said Dumbledore calmly. Voldemort had powers I will never have. Only because you're too, well, noble to use them. It's lucky it's dark. I haven't blushed such since Madame Pomfrey told me she liked my new earmuffs. Professor McGonagall shot a sharp look at Dumbledore and said, The owls are nothing next to the rumors that are flying around. You know what everyone's saying about why he's disappeared? About what finally stopped him? It seems Professor McGonagall had reached the point she was most anxious to discuss. The real reason she had been waiting on a cold, hard wall all day. For neither as a cat nor woman had she fixed nor as a woman had she fixed Dumbledore with such piercing stare as she did now. It was plain to whatever everyone was saying. She was not going to believe until Dumbledore told her it was true. Dumbledore, however, was choosing another lemon drop and did not answer. What they're saying, she pressed on, is that last night Voldemort turned up at Godric's Hollow. He went to find the Potters. The rumor is that Lily and James Potter are that they're dead. Dumbledore bowed his head. Dumbledore gasped. Lily and James. I can't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. Oh, wait. That was supposed to be Dumbledore. I mean, McGonagall speaking, but who cares? Oh, Albus. Dumbledore reached out and patted her on the shoulder. I know, he said heavily. Professor McGonagall's voice trembled as she went on. That's not all. They're saying he tried to kill the Potter's son, Harry. But he couldn't. He couldn't kill that little boy. No one knows why or how, but they're saying that when he couldn't kill Harry Potter, Voldemort's power somehow broke. And that's why they're gone. Dumbledore nodded glumly. It's true? Faltered Professor McGonagall. After all he's done? All the people he's killed? He couldn't kill a little boy? It's astounding. It's just astounding. Of all the things to stop him. But how in the name of heaven did Harry survive? We can only guess, said Dumbledore. We may never know. Professor McGonagall pulled out a lace handkerchief and dabbed her eyes beneath her spectacles. Dumbledore had a great sniff as he took a golden watch from his pocket and examined it. It was a very odd watch. It had 12 hands, but no numbers. Instead, little planets that were moving around the edge. It must have made sense to Dumbledore, though, because he put it back in his pocket and said, Hagrid's late. I suppose it was he who told you I'd be here, by the way. Yes, said Professor McGonagall. And I don't suppose you're going to tell me why you're here, of all places. I've come to bring Harry to his aunt and uncle. They're the only family he has left now. You don't mean? You can't mean the people who live here, cried Professor McGonagall, jumping to her feet and pointing at number 4. Dumbledore, you can't. I've been watching them all day. You couldn't find 2 people who are less like us? And they've got this son. I saw him kicking his mother all the way up the street, screaming for sweets. Harry Potter, and live here? It's the best place for him, said Dumbledore firmly. His aunt and uncle will be able to explain everything to him when he's older. I've written them a letter. A letter, repeated Professor McGonagall faintly, sitting back down on the wall. Really, Dumbledore? You think you can explain all this in a letter? These people will never understand him. He'll be famous, a legend. I wouldn't be surprised if today was known as Harry Potter Day in the future. There will be books written about Harry. Every child in the world will know his name. Exactly, said Dumbledore, looking very seriously over the top of his half-moon glasses. It would be enough to turn any boy's head. Famous before he could walk and talk. Famous for something he won't even remember. Can't you see how much better he'll be growing up away from all that until he's ready to take it? Professor McGonagall opened her mouth, changed her mind. This is going on so long.
Yeah.
Swallowed, and then said, yes, you're right, of course. But how is the boy getting here, Dumbledore? She eyed his cloak suddenly, as though she thought he might be hiding Harry underneath it. Hagrid's bringing him. You think it wise to trust Harry with something important as this? I would trust Hagrid with my life, said Dumbledore. I'm not saying his heart isn't in the right place, said Professor McGonagall grudgingly. But you can't pretend he's not careless. He does tend to. What was that? A low rumbling sound had broken the silence around them. It grew steadily louder as they looked up and down the street for some sign of a headlight. It swelled to a roar as they both looked up at the sky, and a huge motorcycle fell out of the air and landed on the road in front of them. The motorcycle was huge, and it was nothing to the man sitting astride it. He was almost twice as tall as a normal man, and at least 5 times as wide. He looked simply too big to be allowed, and so wild. Long tangles of bushy black hair and beard hid most of his face. He had hands the size of trash can lids. His feet in their leather boots were like baby dolphins. In his vast, muscular arms, he was holding a bunch of blankets. Hagrid, said Dumbledore, sounding relieved. At last! And where did you get that motorcycle? Borrowed it, Professor Dumbledore, sir, said the giant, climbing carefully off the motorcycle as he spoke. Young Sirius Black lent it to me. I've got him, sir. No problems, were there? No, sir. House was almost destroyed, but I got him out all right before the muggles started swarming around. He fell fast asleep as we was flying over Bristol. Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall bent forward over the bundle of blankets. Inside, just visible, was a baby boy fast asleep under the tufts of jet black hair over his forehead. They could see a curiously shaped cut, like a lightning bolt. Is that where Professor McGonagall whispered Professor McGonagall? Yes, said Dumbledore. "He'll have that scar forever." "Couldn't you do something about it, Dumbledore?" "Even if I could, I wouldn't. Scars can come in handy. I have one myself above my left knee, and it's a perfect map of the London Underground. Well, give him here, Hagrid. We'd better get this over with." Dumbledore took Harry in his arms and turned toward the Dursleys' house. Could I say goodbye to him, sir?" said Hagrid. He bent his great shaggy beard over Harry and gave him what must have been a very scratchy, whiskery kiss. Then suddenly Hagrid let out a howl like a wounded dog. "Shh!" hissed Professor McGonagall. "You'll wake up the Muggles!" Sorry," sobbed Hagrid, taking out a large spotted handkerchief and burying it in his face. "But I can't stand it. Lily and James dead." "And poor little Harry off to live with Muggles." Yes, it's all very sad. But get a grip of yourself, Hagrid, or we'll be found," Professor McGonagall whispered, patting Hagrid gingerly on the arm as Dumbledore stepped over the low garden wall and walked to the front door. He laid Harry gently on the doorstep, took a letter out of his cloak, tucked it inside Harry's blankets, and then came back to the other two. For a full minute, the three of them stood and looked at the little bundle. Hagrid's shoulders shook. Professor McGonagall blinked furiously, and the twinkling light that usually shone from Dumbledore's eyes seemed to have gone out. "Get your foot out my face. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Keep that foot out my face." "Well," said Dumbledore finally, "that's that. We've no business staying here. We may as well go and join the celebrations." "Yeah," said Hagrid in a very muffled voice. "I'd best get this bike away. Good night, Professor McGonagall. Professor Dumbledore, sir." Wiping his streaming eyes on his jacket sleeve, Hagrid swung himself onto the motorcycle and kicked the engine into life. With a roar, it rose into the air and off into the night. "I'll see you soon, I expect, Professor McGonagall," said Dumbledore, nodding to her. Professor McGonagall blew her nose in reply. Dumbledore turned and walked back down the streets. On the corner, he stopped and looked out to the took out the silver put-outer. He clicked it once, and the 12 balls of light sped back into their street lamps, so that Privet Drive glowed suddenly orange, and he could make out a tabby cat slinking around the corner and the other end of the street. At the other end of the street, he could just see the bundle of blankets on the step of number 4. "Good luck, Harry," he murmured. He turned on his heel, and with a swish of his cloak, he was gone. A breeze ruffled the neat hedges of Privet Drive, which lay silent and tidy under the inky sky, and the very last place you'd expect astonishing things to happen. Harry Potter rolled over inside his blankets without waking up. One small hand closed on the letter beside him, and he slept on, not knowing he was special, not knowing he was famous, not knowing he could be woken in a few hours by Mrs. Dursley's scream as she opened the front door to put out the milk bottles, nor that he would spend the next few weeks being prodded and pinched by his cousin Dudley. He couldn't know. At this very moment, people meeting in secret all over the country were holding up their glasses and saying in hushed voices, "To Harry Potter, the boy who lived." And that concludes Chapter 1 of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. So, that's done. Me reading that story to my brother did not get him to sleep. So, probably won't make this the purpose of these videos. Probably just do it whenever I feel like it. I'll try to at least make it weekly, because I need YouTube content. And yeah. And I needed that. You going to sleep?
Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna make this dimmer. There we go. I don't know what time it is when you're watching this.